The peach hit her shoulder just as she reached for her glass of water. It wasn't tossed in secret. It was flung with purpose, overarm, so the whole room could see the mess it made on her velvet dress. Marjorie Caldwell froze mid-motion, the juice running down her collarbone like shame itself, while the mayor's wife smirked from her corner. "That's for stealing husbands with money, not love," someone muttered loud enough for the chandeliers to echo it. The entire hall, decorated for the annual Prescott Founders Banquet, held its breath as the once-beloved widow dabbed herself clean in silence. No one stepped forward. No one stopped it. She had buried Harold Caldwell 3 winters ago and inherited half the county. At first, they had courted her politely, inviting her to tea and asking after her grief. But the sympathy soured quickly into resentment. Her fortune outlived their patience. Every dress she wore became a rumor. Every kindness was recast as manipulation. By spring, they stopped pretending. And tonight, with a bruised peach and a dining hall of eyes watching her soak in the insult, they'd made it official. Marjorie did not shout. She did not cry. She placed her napkin on the table with perfect poise, stood, and walked out of the Prescott Hall into the dark street, the sound of music and laughter closing behind her like a slammed gate. Her carriage wasn't waiting. The driver had vanished. No one came to fetch her wrap. She walked 6 blocks alone, past stables and curtained windows, to the edge of town. When she reached her estate, a grand white-columned home bought with rail money and widowhood, she didn't light the lamps. She took off the ruined dress, folded it neatly, and placed it in the stove. As it burned, the flame inside her didn't roar. It quieted. 2 days later, without a word to her staff, she left with 1 satchel, 1 horse, and a deed to a strip of land bordering the San Francisco peaks. The land had been Harold's investment, arid, unloved Apache country. But for the first time since her husband's funeral, Marjorie wanted to go where no one knew her name, and where peaches never flew. The sound of hooves on shale startled her mare just as dusk rolled over the canyon. Marjorie gripped the reins tighter, scanning the high ridges. She'd ridden past the last known settlement hours ago, guided only by the map Harold once marked in red ink. Too barren for cattle, waste of coin. But now, nestled between 2 cliffs, she saw movement. It wasn't a man. It was a child. A boy no older than 7, standing barefoot on the rock with a turquoise blanket draped over his shoulders. His dark hair blew wildly in the wind, but his eyes didn't flinch. He watched her with a calmness that unsettled her more than any wildcat would have. Marjorie dismounted slowly. "Are you lost?" she asked. The boy said nothing. He pointed at the sack tied to her saddle, then to the canyon behind him. It was more gesture than request, an invitation. She followed. The trail narrowed, and he led her through twisting stone paths that made her question every mile Harold had dismissed. After half an hour, they reached a clearing tucked behind cedar trees. A ring of stones marked a fire pit long gone cold. There were no houses, only makeshift lean-tos fashioned from animal hide and stripped branches. But she saw movement. 3 children, all younger than the boy. One held a rabbit, another nursed a swollen ankle, the third clutched a wooden doll carved from a pine branch. The boy looked at her again, this time with the faintest tilt of the head. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't warning. It was something older. Trust earned, not given. Marjorie opened her sack. Dried bread, 2 apples, a half-tin of beans, and 1 wrapped sugar cube. She placed them near the fire pit without speaking. The children approached like deer, cautious but drawn by hunger. No one touched her. No one begged. They simply accepted. She didn't know if their parents were dead or hunting or watching from the trees, but something about the way the boy stood, straight, guarding them all, told her they'd been alone for longer than most children survive. When night fell, the boy dragged a second blanket from a wooden crate and handed it to her. Blue and red patterned, worn but whole. She took it without a word. The stars came alive above them, the canyon holding the silence like a promise. And for the first time since the banquet, Marjorie felt no eyes judging her, only 4 small lives, pressing close to her fire as if she belonged. Marjorie awoke to the soft rhythm of chanting. It wasn't loud, but it was deep, woven with the same calm power she'd felt in the boy's stare. The children were already awake, sitting cross-legged around the fire pit where a new flame now danced. Standing across from them was a man. Tall, still as stone. His long hair was braided with bone and feather, his chest bare beneath a dark deerskin wrap that fluttered at his side. In his right hand, he held a staff adorned with turquoise stones and an eagle's talon. His gaze met hers without blinking. She knew instantly. This was their chief. And more than that, this was the boy's father. She rose slowly, brushing dust from her skirt, unsure whether to speak. But the boy stood between them and said something in a language she didn't know. The chief gave one nod, then walked toward her. Every muscle in her back tensed. Memories of every judgmental glance from town, every hand that shoved her aside after Harold's scandal. But he didn't raise his voice. He didn't even speak. He simply placed a small satchel at her feet. Inside, dried berries, smoked rabbit, and strips of cloth. She looked up, confused. "Why?" she whispered. He pointed to the children, then to her heart, as if saying, "They're alive because of you." The chief turned and walked toward a cluster of tall trees where a small structure stood. His shelter. The boy followed, but not before glancing back at her once more. Later that morning, the children showed her how to gather bark from the dry birch, how to chew certain leaves for sore throats, how to keep fire hidden from rain. None of them spoke English, but somehow it didn't matter. Her hands learned what their mouths couldn't teach. When the wind picked up, she offered her own shawl to the girl with the carved doll. The girl giggled, wrapping it like a dress. That laughter, light, full, completely untouched by the weight Marjorie had carried, did something to her ribs. It cracked them wide open. That night, as the fire cast long shadows against the canyon walls, the chief returned. He didn't enter the circle. He sat on the far edge, watching. Marjorie didn't try to speak. But when the boy brought her a wooden bowl of stew, and the smallest child nestled into her side, she saw the chief tilt his head ever so slightly, as if granting permission, or respect, or both. And she realized, out here, names and dowries meant nothing. Only what you carried and what you gave. The next morning, the children weren't waiting for her. They were gone, scattered into the brush before dawn. Marjorie stepped outside the shelter, heart catching with panic. But then she saw him. The chief. He stood at the edge of the clearing, holding a long branch stripped of bark. Without speaking, he motioned for her to follow. She hesitated. For a woman who'd once been paraded in silk gloves and tight corsets, chasing after a silent man in leather and feathers felt like stepping off a cliff. But she followed. They hiked past the place she'd nearly frozen, past the broken sled, the tattered fabric from her torn skirts still hanging on a bush like a ghost. She thought he was bringing her back to say goodbye. But then he pointed to a patch of disturbed earth, shallow and narrow. Her grave. He had found it. Dug it himself, most likely. She looked at him, throat tight. "You saw them leave me?" He nodded once. Then, with the branch, he scratched lines into the dirt. 4 long slashes, 1 short, then circled them. She didn't understand. So he reached for a piece of coal from the remains of a burned stump and pressed it into her hand. Then he turned and walked away, back into the trees. That night, as she helped the older boy braid grass into baskets, the smallest child brought her a piece of hide, freshly cleaned. On it, drawn in careful strokes, was the same symbol. 4 long lines, 1 short, a circle. She pointed to it, confused. The boy said a word. Soda. Then again, tapping her chest this time. Soda. She didn't know what it meant, but all the children nodded, repeating it softly, like a prayer. That night, the chief placed a carved stone near the fire. It bore the same symbol. And beside it, a length of beaded twine. Not flashy, not ceremonial, but sacred. When Marjorie tried to speak, he raised a hand gently and said the first English word she'd ever heard him say. Name. The next day, a storm rolled in. The children huddled inside, and she sat in the center with them, holding the smallest against her chest. She told stories, not of high society balls or scandalous suitors, but of garden herbs and mountain birds, and the time she fell from a tree trying to catch a squirrel. They laughed, she laughed, and outside, in the cold rain, the chief stood again, watching. Not as a man suspicious of a stranger, but as one who had given her something even Harold never offered. A place, a name, a belonging that didn't need gold to make it real. When the rain passed, it left more than puddles in the soil. It carved something open inside Marjorie. She no longer looked for the sound of wagons or hoped for hoofbeats. The world she had come from, lace gloves, teaspoons, whispered reputations, felt like a discarded costume. What filled her now was the rhythm of survival, mending torn tunics, learning the calls of birds, burning herbs for fevers and boiling roots for dye. The children brought her lessons daily. She began to understand their names. Toya, the oldest girl with eyes sharp as needles. Coda, the quiet boy who carved birds into bark. Even the twins, all elbows and mischief, who once stole her shoes and filled them with berries. And every evening, as shadows stretched across the land, the chief returned from wherever he vanished to. Always silent, always watching. One dusk, she saw him holding something in his calloused hands. Her wedding ring. Rusted now, dented from ice and earth, but unmistakable. He didn't give it to her, just held it between them. Then he knelt, dug a small hole near the fire, and buried it. No speech, no ritual, just buried, a funeral for what once bound her. That night, as embers glowed low, she asked the chief, halting, awkward, why they let her stay. He pointed toward the children, then to the fire, then to his own chest. Not let, he said slowly, voice thick with accent but certain. Stay because you stayed. It was the most English she'd heard him speak. She wept. Not from sadness, but from something deeper. She realized she wasn't healing. She had already healed. The next morning she rose before the children and walked to the far ridge. The wind tugged at her braids she'd learned to weave herself, not for beauty, but to keep the strands out of her eyes as she worked. She saw a hawk rising in the sky, circling. And behind her, soft footfalls. It was Toya, carrying a piece of leather stitched with beads, a shawl, not fancy, but woven with patience. Winter soon, Toya said. You need warm. Marjorie wrapped it around her shoulders and whispered, Thank you. But Toya just smiled and said the word again. Sota. She was not the woman who had arrived in furs, not the widow who'd wept at banquets or begged for forgiveness. She was the woman who stayed. And in the breath between 2 winds, she realized she never wanted to leave. That night, The circle around the fire was tighter than usual. The sky had deepened into a dome of black silk, pricked with stars, and the scent of pine smoke mingled with roasted deer. The tribe had returned from a long hunting journey, their faces dusted with ash and wind, but their voices were light with quiet pride. Marjorie moved among them with a pot of stew, her hands steady. She no longer flinched when someone brushed past her, no longer waited for instructions or permission. She simply belonged. When she passed the chief, he took the bowl with both hands and nodded. That small nod felt heavier than any titled greeting she'd ever received in Boston. Across from her, one of the elders began a story, long, winding, full of pauses and laughter in the children's eyes. Marjorie didn't understand all the words, but she followed the shape of the tale. A woman who fell into a river and was thought lost, until the earth gave her back with a new name. The listeners clapped at the end. The chief looked over the flames at Marjorie, and his gaze was softer than she'd ever seen. Later, after the children curled into furs and the fire was low, he remained. She remained. Neither of them spoke, just the pop of ember and the hush of wind between trees. Then, quietly, he placed a small carved object in her lap. A figure. Not beautiful in the way ivory dolls were beautiful, but strong. Broad shoulders, skirt to the ankles, hair in 2 braids. It was her, carved from cedar. "You made this?" she whispered. He nodded once. "You're here," he said. "So now you stay. This is right." Her hands trembled as she held it, not for the craftsmanship, though it was careful, reverent, but because no man had ever captured her this way, not for charm, not for possession, but because she'd become real to him. That night, she didn't return to the guest shelter. She slept by the fire, beside the children. She wasn't asked. It simply felt like the truth. At dawn, as frost kissed the earth and smoke coiled up into the heavens, a voice from one of the women called her name. Not Marjorie. Something else. Yana. She didn't know the meaning. But when she asked Toya, the girl just smiled. "It means fire that stays." Marjorie pressed her fingers to her chest. Fire that stays. She was becoming someone new. Not queen, not widow. Something deeper. Something earned. The first time she heard them chant her name in full, Yana Tai, fire that stays through storm, was not during a ceremony but in a moment of urgency. One of the younger hunters had returned limping, blood seeping from a wound to his side. No one called for help. They just moved. And so did she. Marjorie, no, Yana, knelt beside him, steady hands ripping linen she'd been saving to mend her only good dress. Her palms pressed into the wound, and her voice, once brittle with fear, spoke calm, firm instructions. "Boil water. Bring clean cloth. Someone hold his head." The warriors obeyed. The wives followed. And the boy, breathing hard through clenched teeth, clung to her eyes like they were the last steady thing in the world. When it was done, when the bleeding slowed and the boy's chest rose without tremor, a ripple passed through the circle. Respect. Not just for what she'd done, but for the way she did it. Quiet. Capable. Present. The old women whispered. The chief said nothing, but she saw the glint in his eyes, like a branch catching dawn after frost. Later that day, Toya pulled her aside and pressed something into her hands. A necklace made of dyed quills, smooth stones, and a polished shell. The center bead was carved like flame. "You wear this now," Toya said with pride. "It says you know how to stay." Yana swallowed hard. "Do I deserve it?" Toya tilted her head. "Not everything is about deserving. Some things are about becoming." That night, they danced, not in the grand, painted way of tribal celebrations, but in a smaller, more sacred circle. the kind made by those who had seen each other break, heal, and still choose to remain. Around the fire, they sang. Songs of winter and women who survived it. Songs of children who returned home. Songs of the wind calling a name until it was answered. When the chief stepped forward, he didn't offer her a seat beside him. He simply placed his palm on her back, light as breath, and stood beside her. It was enough. More than enough. For the first time since her husband's betrayal, Marjorie, Yana, no longer felt like something to be claimed or cast off. She was part of something. Not because she was taken in, but because she had stayed in. Chosen, not chased. Seen, not saved. The next morning, when the sun rose through the pine boughs and touched her face, it didn't feel borrowed. It felt like her own light, returned. The snow had melted in patches, revealing the earth beneath like old scars healing beneath sunlight. Yana crouched near the fire, showing Toya how to fold leaves into bundles to hold crushed herbs. A child's giggle rang behind her, one of the twin boys chasing a chicken too smart for him. For a moment it was peace, until the wind changed. It came low and hot, brushing her cheek like an old, unwelcome breath. Behind it came hoofbeats. She stood before she could think. 5 riders, white men, dust-covered and thin with cold and pride, emerged from the trees like they'd ridden straight out of her memory. One of them dismounted, his voice cracking like ice. Her name was Marjorie Dane, widow of Philip Dane. We come for what's ours. The words didn't sting. What stung was the way he said ours, as if she were an object that had slipped out of some ledger and now needed accounting. She said nothing, but Toya stepped forward, chin high. She has a name here. The man laughed. I bet she's got many. She's a fine actress after all. Took my brother's land, his pride, then ran off to this. He spat in the snow. You gonna keep her? Dress her up like some queen in your little campfire kingdom? The Apache chief did not move. But Yana did. She stepped between them and said, voice like flint, he didn't keep me. I stayed. The other men shifted in their saddles. The leader leaned in, eyeing her the way someone might a burned map, unreadable but still dangerous. You know this ain't the life you were born for. Yana met his gaze. I know it's the life I became worthy of. Behind her, the chief raised one hand, not in anger, but peace. This woman is not your burden, and not your shame. The man smirked. She's something, all right. Ask around town. They still call her Widow Whiskey. That did it. One of the Apache boys, no more than 10, marched forward and stood beside her, arms folded. She's not a widow. She's our flame. The man looked down, startled. For a beat, the camp was silent. Then Yana touched the boy's shoulder and said softly, Go on. Feed the chickens. I'll be all right. And somehow she knew it was true. The men turned. The riders left, not defeated but dismissed, like a wind that had blown too hard for too long and finally ran out of breath. And the earth they left behind was still hers. When the snow melted fully, the village elders called a gathering. Yana hadn't known what it was for, only that she was asked to wear the turquoise necklace Toya had carved for her, and that the women helped her braid her hair with wildflowers. Children ran with sticks pretending they were horses, and songs rose from deep drums as the fire was lit in the center of the village ring. But when she stepped into the circle, silence fell like a soft snowfall. The Apache chief stood alone by the fire, a single eagle feather in his hand. He didn't speak in ceremony. He didn't make a show. He simply turned to the elders, then to her. She did not ask to be part of us, he said, his voice slow and clear. She came carrying only pain, but she gave medicine, gave bread, gave names to those who had none. And when the snow came, she stayed. Yana blinked as if it might all disappear. A few elders murmured softly in agreement. One placed a clay bowl of sweet water at her feet. Another stepped forward and handed her a folded shawl, bright red and woven with white deer. But it was Toya's gesture that broke her. The girl stepped forward, took Yana's hand, and placed the eagle feather in her palm. "My father calls you Firelight," Toya whispered, "but I call you my mother." Yana dropped to her knees, holding the child to her, shaking with tears she didn't expect. There were no crowds here to judge her. No parlors, no silver forks or whispered gossip behind fans. And yet this felt like the grandest coronation she could imagine, because it wasn't about pride. It was about place and family and finally being seen as more than what she had lost. An old woman with deep creases and 2 long gray braids stepped up next. "We do not give crowns here, but we do give names. You are no longer Marjorie Dane, the widow. You are Yana, the one who warms the cold." A soft cheer rippled across the gathering. Not loud, not raucous, just true. And in that moment, Yana understood something no ballroom could ever teach her. You can be called queen 100 times, but it means nothing until you're chosen by people who see your heart, not your name. And under the stars, among wild drums and the smell of corn ash, Yana was chosen. Years later, when travelers passed through the valley during harvest season, they would sometimes see her sitting near the fire with a child in her lap, her graying hair woven with faded blue threads, and they'd ask who she was. The children always answered the same. "She's Yana, she's ours." The word widow had long since faded, so had guest. Yana had never married again. The chief never asked, nor did she. But what grew between them wasn't absence. It was quiet presence. They cooked together, sat beside each other during storm winds. And when the tribe moved camps, he always waited for her to finish gathering her satchels, even when the others were far ahead. It wasn't the romance she'd once imagined, but it was something sturdier, something real. When the cold came again, her 4th winter in the valley, she did not fear it. The children had stacked firewood for weeks. The chief's sister had taught her to line the inside of the walls with pine tar and quilted hide. And each morning, someone always left a basket of dried apples or root mash by her door. The people remembered what she had given in her first season there, and they returned it tenfold. One evening, Toya slipped inside, now nearly grown, her hair longer than Yana's had ever been. "You know what they say about you now?" she whispered, grinning. "They say you were sent by the earth to warm the broken." Yana laughed, shaking her head. "They should have seen me at the banquet table," she muttered. But even as she said it, she knew that life belonged to someone else. Someone who'd been trying too hard to be worthy in a world that only saw the surface. That night, Toya brought her a folded piece of hide, painted with tiny symbols in dark berry ink. It was a map, drawn by the children, with her hut at the center. Around it, not just streams and trails, but names. "Safe place. Mother Fire. Where we begin." Yana ran her fingers over the soft leather. It wasn't a crown, but it was the truest marking of belonging she'd ever received. And as the snow began to fall again, dusting the rooftop like powdered sugar, she didn't shiver. She simply pulled the deer-hide shawl over her shoulders, stirred the fire, and whispered a silent prayer to the wind. "Let every woman left in the cold find what I found. Not shelter. Home." And in that glowing circle of firelight, surrounded by children who'd never once asked about her past, she found the kind of warmth that no society could ever give. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you had seen her there, kneeling in the circle with that feather, would you have cheered for her too? Tell us in the comments.